I woke up with a burning sensation in my chest, like 1,000 needles puncturing my lungs with every desperate gasp. The oxygen mask that clung to my face was the only thread tethering me to life, yet even with it, each breath felt shallow, fragile, on the verge of slipping away. The room smelled of disinfectant and cold metal, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me like distant insects. I blinked, trying to focus, and that's when I saw her, my mother, Margaret, standing at the foot of my bed, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. There was no trace of worry in her face, only annoyance, as if my existence were an inconvenience she had endured for too long. Her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smirk before she spoke the first words I heard that morning. "You're not that important." Those words pierced me deeper than any needle or scalpel ever could. I wanted to scream, to tell her how much those words hurt, but my body betrayed me. My throat was too dry, my lungs too weak, and the mask muffled every attempt at sound. Instead, I could only stare at her, my eyes widening in disbelief and raw ache. I searched for some sign of hesitation in her, a flicker of guilt, maybe even a misplaced softness, but her expression remained icy, impenetrable. The monitor beside me beeped steadily, a mechanical reminder that my life was being measured in numbers and graphs, while the woman who had given me life looked on as though she were waiting for it to end. For a fleeting second, I wondered if death would be a relief, not because I wanted to leave, but because I was exhausted from fighting to prove my existence mattered to her. In the corner of the room, my father, Robert, sat slouched in a chair, his hands gripping his knees tightly as if anchoring himself to silence. He had always been like that, present but absent, watching but never intervening. His eyes flickered between me and my mother, full of something that looked like shame, but he didn't say a word. I wanted him to rise, to defend me, to tell her that I was important, that I mattered not only as his daughter but as a human being clinging to the edge of life. But as always, his silence screamed louder than anything else. The betrayal in that silence was heavy, pressing against me almost as harshly as the absence of oxygen had when I first woke up. Margaret moved closer to my bed, her heels clicking against the sterile floor with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. She leaned over me, her perfume, a sharp floral scent, invading the small air I had left to breathe. Her fingers reached out, not with tenderness, but with impatience, and she tugged the oxygen mask down from my face with a sudden jerk. The cold air hit my lips and nose, but instead of relief, I felt my chest tighten as though the room itself had shrunk, crushing me from every side. I gasped violently, my mouth opening wide, searching desperately for air that refused to fill me. She didn't flinch, she didn't panic. She simply looked at me with a strange satisfaction, as if watching me suffer somehow confirmed the twisted image of weakness she had always painted of me. Every instinct screamed for survival. My hands clawed weakly at the sheets, at the mask, at anything I could grip to anchor myself back into life. My heart thundered, my vision blurred, and the sounds around me muffled until all I could hear was the desperate pounding of blood in my ears. I wanted to beg her, to plead for her to put the mask back on, but I knew that even if I could speak, she would only tilt her head and watch me suffer longer. She had done this before, not in such an obvious way, but in subtle, countless moments throughout my life. Times when I was sick and she ignored me, times when she told me to stop exaggerating, times when she reminded me, again and again, that I was nothing but a burden. And yet, in that moment, part of me still wanted her love. The cruel paradox of a child's heart is that no matter how cold, how cutting, how destructive a parent can be, there remains a deep-rooted ache for their affection. As the world tilted around me, and black spots danced at the edge of my vision, I wondered why I still longed for her approval. Why, even now as she held my life hostage in her hands, did I wish she would change? Maybe because I had spent my entire life waiting for her to say something different, to look at me differently, to finally choose me instead of despising me. But in her narrowed eyes, I saw the truth. She had no intention of saving me. Not now. Not ever. The sound of hurried footsteps snapped me back to the present. Nurse Clara burst into the room, her eyes widening in horror at the sight of me gasping, the mask hanging loose by my chin. "What are you doing?" she cried, rushing forward to snatch the mask from Margaret's hand and secure it back over my mouth and nose. Sweet, blessed oxygen rushed in again, burning my throat but filling my lungs with life. I sucked it in greedily, the monitor beeping wildly as my body fought to stabilize. Clara's hands were firm, protective, and for the first time that morning, I felt like someone cared whether I lived or died. My mother stepped back casually, feigning innocence, her lips curving into a cold smile as she muttered, "It slipped." But it hadn't slipped. I knew it. Clara knew it. Even the doctor who rushed in moments later seemed to sense it. Margaret's lie hung in the room like poison, but no one dared call it out. Not yet. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, staring at the floor, his shame deepening with every second of silence. I wanted to scream, to expose her, to tell them all that this wasn't an accident, that my mother wanted me gone, but my body was still too weak, too reliant on the mask, and my voice was nothing more than a rasp lost beneath the hiss of oxygen. So I lay there, staring at her, at the woman who should have been my protector, realizing that I was not only fighting my illness, I was fighting her, and maybe, just maybe, she was the more dangerous enemy. As the room settled again, with Clara hovering protectively by my side and the doctor adjusting my monitors, I closed my eyes briefly, trying to calm the storm inside me. The oxygen mask hissed softly, steady and mechanical, but underneath that sound was the echo of my mother's words. "You're not that important." They repeated in my head like a curse, like a prophecy she had tried to engrave into my very being since I was a child. But as weak as I was, lying on that bed with machines breathing for me, a flicker of defiance ignited in my chest. Maybe I couldn't say it aloud yet, but I promised myself silently I would survive, if not for me, then to spite her. To prove, once and for all, that my existence mattered, whether she wanted it to or not. I couldn't sleep that night. The hospital corridor hummed with the faint sounds of machines and distant footsteps. But in my mind, all I could hear was her voice echoing over and over again. "You're not that important." Those words sank into my skin like thorns, each syllable reminding me of every other time she'd cut me down, minimized me, erased me. As I lay there with the oxygen mask pressed against my face, I realized this wasn't new. It was a continuation of something she had been feeding me since childhood. This hospital bed was just the latest stage for her cruelty, only now it had become so sharp, so undeniable, that even the walls seemed to feel it. I stared at the ceiling tiles, tracing the cracks, remembering moments I had tried so hard to bury, and for the first time in years, I let myself face them. I was 8 years old when I first realized that my mother's love was conditional, if it ever existed at all. I had come home from school with a certificate for winning the spelling bee, my little chest bursting with pride, desperate to show her. I placed it on the kitchen table where she was reading, expecting her to smile or hug me, to say, "Well done, Jocelyn." Instead, she barely glanced at it and muttered, "Don't act like you're special. Other kids win things too." The certificate felt heavy in my hands after that, meaningless, and I remember tearing it up later that night in my room, crying into my pillow so she wouldn't hear. It was in that moment I learned that achievements meant nothing to her, not unless they could somehow make her look better. My worth, in her eyes, was always tied to what she could gain, never to who I was. But there were deeper wounds, ones that festered quietly, unspoken, but never forgotten. I remembered nights when I was sick with fever, shivering and weak, begging her for help. She would glance at me, annoyed, and say things like, "You'll be fine. Stop being dramatic." Sometimes she wouldn't even come into my room, leaving me alone with my trembling body and burning forehead, the shadows on the wall, my only company. And yet, no matter how many times she dismissed me, I still kept running to her, hoping that maybe this time would be different, that maybe this time she would put a cool hand to my forehead, bring me soup, sit by my bed like the mothers I read about in storybooks. But the pages of my reality were always empty of that kind of tenderness. The strangest part was how different she acted in front of others. When family visited or neighbors came by, she would play the role of the perfect mother, offering me cookies she hadn't baked, praising me for things she had ignored, and touching my shoulder with a rehearsed affection that fooled everyone but me. They would smile and say, "You're so lucky to have such a caring mom." And I would smile back, because the alternative, to expose the truth, felt impossible. Who would believe me? Who would think that behind closed doors she was cold, sharp, and calculating? It made me feel invisible, as though I lived in two worlds, the one people saw, and the one that was hidden inside the walls of our home. My father's silence had always been the cruelest chorus to her venom. He never raised his voice, never contradicted her, never even looked uncomfortable in front of others. But when we were alone, when I cried after one of her barbed comments, he would avoid my eyes. He would mutter things like, "That's just how she is," as though that explained or excused everything. For years, I begged him to stand up for me, to step between us, to be the shield I needed, but he never did. And so, I grew up learning that I was not only unwanted, but unprotected, that the two people who should have been my safest place had left me stranded, alone, with no one to turn to. That realization carved itself into my bones, shaping the way I saw love, trust, and even myself. Back in the hospital, the memory of those years made me tremble, not just from weakness, but from rage. Rage at her for tearing me down. Rage at him for letting her. Rage at myself for still wanting them to care even now. I pressed my hand lightly against the mask, feeling the rhythm of each breath, and thought about how much of my life had been spent trying to earn something that was never offered. I had tried to be the best student, the quietest child, the most obedient daughter, and none of it had been enough. She always found new ways to remind me of my inadequacy, new reasons why I didn't matter. And yet here I was, still fighting for every breath, still existing in spite of her attempts to erase me. Nurse Clara checked on me several times during the night, her soft voice whispering, "You're safe, Jocelyn. You're going to be okay." I wanted to believe her, but how could I, when the danger wasn't just in my failing body, but in the woman who had given birth to me? Every time the door creaked open, my heart raced, terrified it would be Margaret stepping back inside, finding some new way to strip me of dignity or air. But Clara's presence was steady, a reminder that not all women were like my mother, that not all hands were made to harm. And yet, the thought haunted me. If Clara hadn't walked in when she did earlier, would I still be alive? Or would my story have ended quietly in that sterile room, dismissed as a medical complication, while the truth of what my mother did remained buried? As dawn crept through the hospital blinds, painting the walls with a pale light, I realized something. Surviving this illness wasn't just about living. It was about reclaiming the worth she had tried to strip from me. I had been trained for years to believe that my life was insignificant, that I was replaceable, forgettable. But as the morning sun touched my face, I felt a fragile spark inside me, the beginning of defiance. I wasn't just going to survive for myself. I was going to survive to prove her wrong, to show her that I was important, not because she said so, but because I chose to be. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself whisper a vow into the mask, a vow I intended to keep. "You will not destroy me." The morning was supposed to bring relief, but instead it carried with it the weight of dread. Margaret appeared again, her sharp heels echoing against the linoleum floor, each step cutting into the fragile calm I had tried to build. She walked into the room with the same air of authority she always carried, as if she owned the very air I was breathing, as if my life was still tethered to her whims. I clutched the blanket tighter around me, my fingers trembling not from fever this time, but from the storm rising inside my chest. Her eyes skimmed over the monitors, the mask, my weakened body, and then she smiled, a smile that held no warmth, only the cruel satisfaction of someone who enjoyed watching another suffer. She spoke as though nothing had happened the night before, as though she hadn't ripped the oxygen mask off my face and nearly stolen the air from my lungs. "You look better today," she said casually, her voice dripping with false concern. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her I remembered, that I wasn't crazy, that her hands had left invisible bruises across my soul, but the words lodged in my throat, tangled with fear and exhaustion. I had learned long ago that calling her out often led to something worse, a sharper wound, a deeper scar, and so I stayed quiet, watching her with a mixture of terror and hatred, waiting for her next move. Nurse Clara entered moments later, her presence like a shield, and Margaret's entire demeanor shifted. Her voice softened, her smile widened, and she even reached for my hand in a rehearsed gesture of maternal affection. "She's my daughter," she told Clara, her tone syrupy, "and I'm just so worried about her." The hypocrisy burned in my chest, but Clara couldn't see through it, at least not fully. To her, Margaret was just another concerned mother standing vigil by her child's side. To me, she was the very reason my body trembled and my breaths came shallow. I wanted to tear the mask off and scream for the world to see her as she truly was, but instead, I gripped Clara's hand with a silent desperation, hoping she might sense the truth through my touch. When Clara left again, Margaret leaned in closer, her breath grazing my ear. "No one will believe you," she whispered, her voice cold as ice. "You've always been dramatic. You'll make yourself look like a liar." The words struck me harder than any slap could have. She knew exactly how to dismantle me, to take my truth and twist it into a story of hysteria. And she was right. Who would believe a daughter accusing her own mother of something so unthinkable? Even I doubted myself sometimes, wondering if I had imagined the malice in her eyes, if the exhaustion and fever had made me hallucinate. But the suffocating terror from the night before was too real to be denied. My body remembered, even if my mind tried to rationalize it away. I drifted between feverish dreams that afternoon, and in each one, Margaret stood over me, pulling away the oxygen, whispering that I was expendable, that I was not meant to survive. I jolted awake with a cry, my chest heaving, only to find her sitting calmly by the bed, knitting of all things, as if she were some doting mother. The sight made me sick. It was the same pattern I had lived with all my life, the cruelty behind closed doors, the performance when others watched. The duality of her existence made me feel trapped in a nightmare, one no one else could see. And yet, every time the mask pressed against my face, and I drew in the precious air it provided, I reminded myself, she could try to take it away, but she couldn't take away my will to live. By evening, my father arrived. his figure timid and uncertain as he stepped into the room. He kissed Margaret on the cheek, as though she were the picture of loyalty and love, then turned to me with a hollow smile. "How are you feeling, Jocelyn?" he asked, his voice flat, almost detached. I stared at him, searching for some sign of recognition, some acknowledgement of what had happened, but his eyes avoided mine. Did he know? Had she told him anything? Or worse, had he chosen not to know, as he had chosen all my life? I felt the silence stretch between us like a canyon, too wide to cross, and I realized in that moment that I could not rely on him any more than I could rely on her. That night, something shifted inside me. As I listened to the machines hum and the oxygen flow, I understood that waiting for them to protect me was futile. They had failed me too many times, and I had paid for their failures with years of pain. If I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to expose her for what she truly was, I would have to find the strength within myself. My body was weak, but my spirit still flickered, small, yet unextinguished. And though fear wrapped itself tightly around me, I knew I had to start documenting, remembering, preparing for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. The following morning, I made my first silent vow of resistance. When Margaret entered, I didn't flinch. I didn't let my eyes dart away from hers. Instead, I held her gaze. Even as my chest rose and fell beneath the mask, she smirked, as if daring me to speak, daring me to fight. And though my voice was still trapped in silence, something in my stare told her what I couldn't yet say. I will not forget. I will not let you erase me again. And for the first time in years, I saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear, not guilt, but the faintest shadow of unease. The days blurred together in a haze of medication, whispered conversations, and the constant hiss of the oxygen machine. Yet something inside me had changed since the night I vowed resistance. Each time Margaret entered the room, I forced myself to watch her carefully, memorizing every word, every subtle motion, as though collecting evidence for a trial no one else knew was coming. She still played her role with perfection, cooing over me in front of nurses, telling visitors how much she worried, but I could feel the strain beneath her mask. It was in the tightness of her jaw when she thought no one was looking, in the impatience of her sigh when Clara lingered too long by my bed. For the first time, I sensed cracks in her performance, and I wondered how much longer she could hold the facade before the truth began to seep through. One afternoon, Dr. Reynolds came in for his routine check, and I caught the way Margaret's eyes hardened when he adjusted my oxygen mask with genuine care. He asked me simple questions about my breathing, my pain levels, and when I struggled to answer, Margaret jumped in with fabricated responses, controlling the narrative as she always did. "She exaggerates her pain," she told him lightly, laughing as though it were a harmless quirk of mine. "She's always been dramatic." The words cut deeper than the fever coursing through my veins. I watched Dr. Reynolds carefully, desperate to know if he believed her, but his neutral expression gave nothing away. Still, I saw his eyes linger on me longer than usual, as though he sensed something was wrong. That brief pause lit a spark of hope inside me that perhaps someone, anyone, could see past her lies. Later that night, I woke gasping for air, panic rising as my chest felt tight and heavy. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought Margaret had taken the mask again, but when I opened my eyes, it was still pressed against my face. The panic attack felt so real that I clutched at the blanket and pressed the call button until Clara rushed in. She checked the machine, adjusted the flow, and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "You're safe," she whispered. But even as she spoke, I could see Margaret in the corner of the room, her eyes glinting with a cruel satisfaction. She didn't need to physically remove the mask this time. Her mere presence was enough to make me feel like I was suffocating. That was her power. She could make me believe I was powerless even when I wasn't. The psychological torment grew unbearable. Every hour was a battlefield between my mind and her manipulations. I wanted to scream, to expose her to Clara, to the doctors, to anyone who would listen. But the fear of not being believed kept me chained. Margaret had been planting seeds of doubt in everyone's minds for years, about my sensitivity, my supposed dramatics, my fragile nature. She had built a fortress of credibility around herself, and I was the unreliable narrator of my own story. But as I lay awake that night, I realized the walls she had constructed weren't impenetrable. I still had fragments of strength left, fragments that I could weave into something stronger if I dared. For the first time, I considered the possibility of speaking, no matter the consequences. The following morning brought an incident that rattled the careful balance of our lives. Margaret, in her eagerness to maintain control, adjusted the flow on my oxygen machine without consulting anyone. I woke to the sensation of too much air rushing into my lungs, forcing me to cough violently, my chest heaving as I clawed at the mask. Alarms blared, and within seconds, nurses swarmed the room, Clara at the front. She quickly adjusted the machine back, her voice firm as she asked Margaret what she had done. My mother feigned ignorance, placing a hand to her chest in mock horror. "I thought it wasn't working properly," she said sweetly. "I only wanted to help." But I saw the flicker in Clara's eyes this time, a fleeting suspicion that perhaps Margaret's care wasn't as innocent as it appeared. Dr. Reynolds arrived shortly after, his tone sharper than I had ever heard it when he addressed Margaret. "Please do not interfere with the equipment again," he said firmly. "It's dangerous." Margaret plastered on her most convincing smile, nodding obediently, but I felt the tension in the room shift. For the first time, someone had questioned her actions openly, stripped her of the unquestioned authority she carried. She shot me a look as he turned away, a look that promised consequences, but instead of shrinking beneath it, I met her eyes with steady defiance. I was terrified, yes, but I was also alive, and that simple fact seemed to enrage her more than anything else. That night, when the room was finally quiet, I lay awake replaying the scene. The alarms, the nurses rushing in, Clara's suspicion, Reynolds' stern warning. It was the beginning of something bigger. For years I had been silenced by fear, but now the truth had begun to leak through, even if only in fragments. I realized that survival wasn't just about breathing through the mask. It was about reclaiming my voice, about ensuring the narrative was no longer hers to control. For the first time, I imagined a future where she couldn't hurt me anymore, a future where I was free. But even as hope began to bloom inside me, a shadow lingered. Margaret had never lost control without retaliating, and I knew she wouldn't stop now. If anything, the exposure of her carelessness would only drive her to darker extremes. Something was coming. I could feel it in the way her eyes followed me, in the silence that stretched between us, in the way my body seemed to tense whenever she moved. The facade was fracturing, and soon the whole truth would break open, but I feared the cost of that revelation might be more than I was ready to pay. The hospital corridors were unusually quiet that evening, a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm. I was half asleep when I felt someone brush past my bed, a whisper of movement that immediately jolted me awake. My chest tightened with dread as I opened my eyes and saw Margaret standing over me, her shadow cutting across the pale light of the monitor. She didn't speak. She only looked down at me with an expression so cold, so detached, it made my skin crawl. Her hands reached for the straps of my oxygen mask, and before I could gather my voice, she pulled it sharply away. Air vanished from my lungs, replaced by a void that burned in my chest. Panic exploded inside me as I clawed at the sheets, my voice rasping against the silence. I tried to speak, to scream, but without the mask, sound fractured into broken gasps. The machine screamed in alarm, its shrill beeping filling the room, but Margaret leaned close, her voice a low hiss, meant only for me. "You are not that important," she whispered, as though the words were a curse. My vision blurred with tears, darkness creeping in at the edges as my body fought for breath. For a moment, I thought this was how it would end, not with peace, not with comfort, but with the cruel dismissal of my own mother's voice echoing in my final moments. It was a kind of suffocation that went beyond the body. It crushed my spirit, too. I thought of Clara, of Dr. Reynolds, of the nurses who might never know the truth, and despair washed over me. But then something shifted. The door burst open, flooding the room with light and voices. Clara had entered on her routine check earlier than usual, and the sight that met her eyes stopped her in her tracks. She saw Margaret, mask in hand, hovering over me as I convulsed with desperate gulps for air. Clara screamed for help, rushing forward to wrench the mask from Margaret and press it back over my face. Air rushed into my lungs, stinging and raw, and I gasped like a drowning woman breaking the surface of the sea. Nurses spilled into the room, their faces pale with shock, their movements urgent as they checked the machine, adjusted the flow, and steadied my trembling body. In that instant, I saw Margaret's mask, her carefully constructed facade, crumble in front of witnesses for the first time. Margaret froze, caught in the center of a storm she could no longer control. Her excuses, usually smooth and polished, tumbled clumsily from her lips. I thought it was twisted. I was only helping," she stammered, but her voice cracked under the weight of so many eyes. Dr. Reynolds arrived within minutes, his face carved in stern disbelief as Clara explained what she had walked in on. He didn't even look at me at first. His gaze was locked on Margaret, measuring every twitch, every stutter of her performance, and for the first time, her words did not shield her. There was no laughter to charm, no lies to weave quickly enough. She had been seen, fully, undeniably seen, and the air in the room turned electric with the realization that everything was about to change. Yet even with all eyes on her, Margaret did not retreat. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and tried once more to reclaim authority. "You people don't understand," she said, her voice louder now, almost commanding. "My daughter is fragile. She doesn't know what she's saying. She misinterprets everything. I have been the only one caring for her, And this, she gestured wildly at the mask. This was a misunderstanding, but her words landed hollow, falling flat against the undeniable evidence of my gasping breaths, the alarms that still rang in the background, and the tremor in Clara's hands as she steadied me. Margaret's performance was unraveling, and she could feel it. Her eyes darted desperately, looking for someone, anyone, who might still believe her. No one spoke. The silence condemned her more than any accusation could have. I lay there trembling, oxygen finally flowing into my lungs again, my body weak, but my spirit ignited. This was the moment I had waited for, the unveiling of the truth. For years I had been silenced, dismissed, made to question my own reality, but now the truth was undeniable. I wanted to shout it from the bed, to tell them all what she had done in secret, how many nights I had endured her cruelty, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I looked directly at Dr. Reynolds, and then at Clara, letting my tear-streaked face speak the volumes I could not. Their expressions told me they understood. The weight I had carried alone for so long was finally being lifted, piece by piece, as others began to see the darkness I had endured. But the scene was far from over. Margaret, cornered and desperate, did something that made even the doctors pale. She lunged toward me, not with care, but with fury, her hand reaching again for the mask as though determined to reclaim control, even in front of everyone. Nurses shouted, Clara pushed forward, and Dr. Reynolds physically intervened, pulling her back with a firmness I had never seen him use before. The room erupted in chaos, the line between patient care and danger blurred in the most terrifying way. I had always known her cruelty, but seeing her lash out openly, brazenly, in front of witnesses, showed me the depth of her unraveling. This was no longer just my private torment. This was something darker, something that demanded the world's attention. As they restrained her, Margaret's voice rose in a shriek that made the walls seem to tremble. She doesn't deserve it. She doesn't deserve to live. The words hung in the air like poison, freezing every heart in the room. Nurses gasped. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and even Dr. Reynolds, steady as ever, looked momentarily shaken. I felt the words strike me harder than the lack of oxygen ever had. All my life, I had suspected her resentment, her bitterness, but hearing it so plainly, so violently, stripped away any doubt. This was no misunderstanding. This was hatred, raw and exposed. And now everyone knew. My mother was not my protector. She was my predator, and the world had finally seen her claws. The aftermath was a blur of orders shouted. Security called, and Margaret dragged from the room still screaming. I lay there trembling, the mask once again steady on my face, as oxygen filled my lungs and tears streamed down my cheeks. For the first time in my life, I was not alone in my suffering. Others had seen, others had heard, and the weight of proof was no longer mine to carry. Yet, even in that moment of vindication, a new fear blossomed inside me. Margaret might have been restrained, but her shadow lingered. She had shown the depth of her malice, and I knew in my heart that this battle was not over. Something darker still lurked in her, something that would not rest until she had destroyed me completely. The morning after the incident, the hospital felt like a battlefield in the eerie quiet that follows chaos. Nurses whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward my room, unable to disguise the tremor of fear they still carried from the night before. When Clara entered, her usually calm face was tight with exhaustion, her steps heavier than usual. She sat beside me, her hand brushing mine gently, as though grounding me to the present. You're safe now, she whispered, but her tone betrayed the uncertainty she could not mask. Safety, I realized, was a fragile word. Margaret had been removed, but her shadow clung to every wall, every corner, every silence. I lay still, haunted by the memory of her words. She doesn't deserve to live. Dr. Reynolds arrived later, clipboard in hand, but his expression stripped of any clinical detachment. He spoke slowly, carefully, as though weighing every syllable. Jocelyn, there will be an investigation, he explained. This is not something the hospital can overlook. His voice was steady, but I could see the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted his glasses. He had seen many things in his career, I imagined, but the sight of a mother trying to suffocate her child was not one that belonged in any hospital's quiet routine. I nodded weakly, though a storm churned inside me. An investigation sounded like hope, but I knew Margaret. She had survived by manipulating truth her entire life. Part of me feared she would twist even this into something I would be blamed for. Clara leaned in when Dr. Reynolds left, her eyes fierce with a kind of loyalty I had never seen in anyone outside of fiction. Don't let her win this time, she urged. Everyone saw what she did. She can't hide anymore. Her conviction should have comforted me, but doubt lingered in my veins. For years, Margaret had trained me to believe I was the unreliable one, the dramatic one, the broken one. Even with witnesses, I wondered if I could stand against her lies. Memories of my childhood resurfaced like shards of glass, moments when I tried to speak out, only to be told I was imagining things. How many times had I doubted my own eyes? How many times had I bent reality to fit hers? The scars were deeper than I'd admitted, and they bled fresh that morning. By afternoon, hospital security escorted Margaret back into the building, but this time under controlled conditions. She wasn't allowed near my room, and yet knowing she was still in the same walls made my skin crawl. I overheard fragments of conversations. She demanded to see me, claimed I had exaggerated, insisted I had begged her for help with the mask. Her words twisted like barbed wire, and I could imagine her rehearsed tones, her crocodile tears. Some staff might still want to believe her. It was easier, after all, to believe in a devoted mother than in a predator who lurked beneath that disguise. That was the danger with Margaret. She wore normalcy like a second skin, and even now, she tried to drape it over her crimes. That night, sleep abandoned me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face hovering above me, cold and resolute. As the air left my lungs, the memory invaded every breath, turning oxygen into ash. I pressed the call button more than once, needing the reassurance of Clara's presence, or the sound of footsteps outside my door. Each time she came, never once complaining, her voice a steady anchor. "You're not alone anymore," she repeated like a mantra, and I clung to those words with everything in me. But when the lights dimmed and the halls quieted, shadows still whispered Margaret's venom, and I realized survival was not just about breathing. It was about reclaiming the parts of me she had stolen long before the hospital walls ever contained us. The next morning, Dr. Reynolds sat with me longer than usual, a seriousness in his eyes that cut through the thin veil of comfort. "Jocelyn," he said softly, "do you want to file charges? What she did wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was an attempt on your life." The word charges settled in the air like a final verdict, heavy and undeniable. I felt both vindicated and terrified. For years, I had longed for someone to see the truth, and now they had. But the thought of formally standing against her, of entering a world where her lies and manipulations would be dissected in court, made my chest tighten. Could I survive her wrath? Could I bear the weight of exposing her fully? Or would she drag me down into the abyss she had always tried to bury me in? Clara's encouragement didn't waver. She sat with me later, holding my hand tightly, her eyes searching mine with a fire that burned hotter than fear. "She already tried to take your life once," she said, her voice low but steady. "If you don't take action, what's to stop her from trying again?" The truth in her words stung like salt on an open wound. Margaret wasn't going to stop. She had revealed her hatred too openly now to simply fade into silence. She would find a way, whether through manipulation, threats, or worse. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was about survival, about refusing to let her darkness swallow me whole. Filing charges wasn't revenge. It was the only way to draw a line she could no longer cross. That evening, as I looked out of the hospital window at the fading sunset, I thought of the child I had once been, the little girl who had cried herself to sleep, wondering why her mother's love always felt like a weapon. That girl had survived, piece by piece, carrying wounds invisible to everyone else. And now, for the first time, the world had seen what I had always known. Margaret's cruelty was not imagined, not exaggerated, but terrifyingly real. The investigation loomed ahead, a road paved with fear and truth, and I knew it would demand more strength than I believed I had. But as I pressed my hand against the cool glass, watching the light slip into night, I whispered to that little girl inside me, "We will not be silent anymore." The investigation began the very next morning, but it wasn't in the form of dramatic courtrooms or flashing cameras. It started in the quiet corners of the hospital, with staff members being asked what they had seen, what they had heard. I could sense the tension as nurses shifted uncomfortably, caught between their duty and the disbelief of what Margaret had done. People didn't want to believe that a mother could rip the oxygen mask off her own daughter's face. It was easier, perhaps safer, to imagine a misunderstanding. I watched their faces as they passed my room, each one holding fragments of truth, fragments that could either protect me or betray me. The world, once so small within the sterile walls of my hospital bed, suddenly became a chessboard of loyalties and secrets. Margaret, of course, was not silent. She wielded her charm like a weapon sharper than any scalpel. I overheard her voice down the hall, soft, pleading, dripping with carefully manufactured grief. She told anyone who would listen that she was desperate to wake me up, that she had panicked seeing me struggle, that she only acted out of love. Her words slid like poison into the ears of anyone willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. And I hated how convincing she sounded, how natural it was for her to weave lies into tapestries so believable that even I, the victim, had moments of faltering. Doubt was her gift, and her curse on me. I could almost hear her whisper, "They'll never believe you." Clara remained my strongest shield, pushing back against Margaret's manipulations at every turn. She collected statements from the nurses who had rushed in that night, reminding them of the look on my mother's face, the intent in her movements, the way she had held down the mask instead of adjusting it. Clara was my anchor when the hospital felt like shifting sand. She told me not to fear the cracks in people's stories, that truth was stubborn. It always left marks. Yet I couldn't ignore the way Margaret hovered just beyond reach, her presence heavy in every conversation, every shadow. She wasn't behind bars. She was free, pacing the halls like a predator still stalking her prey, and that knowledge stole sleep from me more effectively than any nightmare. The official interview with the hospital administration came on the third day. 2 men in suits entered my room, their faces polite but detached, as though already bracing for the storm of conflicting testimonies. They asked me to recount every detail, what Margaret said, what she did, how I felt as the air was ripped from my lungs. My voice trembled at first, but the words began to flow, sharp and vivid, as though speaking them aloud finally carved reality into stone. I described the look in her eyes, cold, unwavering, and the way her hands pressed firmly against the mask. One of the men scribbled notes furiously, while the other simply studied me, his gaze calculating, weighing whether my story bore the gravity of truth or the weakness of desperation. Margaret had her turn that afternoon. I wasn't present, but I didn't need to be. I could imagine every syllable. She would cry, of course, wiping tears with trembling hands, insisting she had only tried to help. She would speak of years of sacrifice, of a daughter who had always misunderstood her, planting seeds of doubt in minds too eager to believe the myth of a suffering mother. By evening, rumors filtered back to me through the thin walls. She had swayed some hearts. Maybe she didn't mean it, one nurse muttered near my door. She looked so devastated. My stomach twisted with rage, not only at her, but at how fragile truth seemed in the face of performance. How could sincerity ever compete with someone who had mastered the art of deception? That night, Clara found me sitting up in bed, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. "They're believing her," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. Clara shook her head firmly, sitting down beside me. "Some might," she admitted, "but not everyone. The truth is stubborn, Jocelyn, and no matter how much she twists it, she can't erase what people saw. Hold on to that." I wanted to believe her, but the walls felt thinner, the air colder. I could almost hear Margaret laughing somewhere in the distance, feeding on the cracks of doubt she had planted like seeds that would bloom into poison. The following morning, Dr. Reynolds entered with a gravity I hadn't seen before. He closed the door, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "There's going to be a hearing," he said. "Not in court yet, but the hospital board has to decide whether to report her actions to the authorities formally. This could mean criminal charges." My chest tightened. The thought of standing before a board, of being dissected under their gazes while Margaret sat across from me weaving her lies, made my hands tremble. But I also felt a strange current of strength, a flicker of defiance I hadn't known was still inside me. This was no longer about survival. It was about truth, about refusing to let her rewrite the story again. That evening, as the hospital quieted and I stared at the ceiling, I thought about how close I had come to death, not just at her hands, but through the years of her slow suffocation of my spirit. Margaret had nearly stolen my breath, but worse, she had nearly stolen my voice. And now, with the board preparing to listen, I realized this was my chance to reclaim it. I whispered into the dark, a vow as much to myself as to the little girl I once was. She doesn't get to silence me anymore. The room was silent, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel like suffocation. It felt like resolve. The day of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that clung to the air like fog. I was wheeled into the small conference room by Clara, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly, the walls lined with somber faces that would decide the direction of my fate. On one side of the long table sat the hospital administrators, their expressions unreadable, pens poised as if every detail of this day would be etched permanently into my file. On the other side, waiting like a shadow, was Margaret. She sat upright, dressed immaculately, her hands folded in her lap, her lips curved into the faintest, most practiced smile. For a moment, it was as if I wasn't her daughter at all, but a stranger she intended to dismantle with precision. When they asked me to begin, my voice shook at first, the memory pressing down on my chest like a weight I had carried too long. I described the moment, the burning panic as she ripped the oxygen mask from my face, the cold determination in her eyes, the terrifying clarity that she meant to strip the breath from me. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. The truth itself was damning enough. As I spoke, my hands trembled, but Clara's steady presence behind me kept me anchored. Every pair of eyes locked on me, some widening with disbelief, others narrowing as though trying to gauge whether pain had clouded my memory. I made myself look at them, forcing them to see me not as a weak patient, but as someone fighting for her own life in more ways than one. Margaret's response was as rehearsed as I'd feared. She leaned forward, her voice thick with emotion, eyes glistening with carefully timed tears. "I panicked," she whispered, shaking her head. "I thought she couldn't breathe. I was desperate to help her." She painted herself as a mother driven by terror, a woman whose only sin was caring too much. Then she shifted, tilting her head with that familiar blend of condescension and concern. "Jocelyn has always been fragile. Sometimes her perception of things is colored by fear." The words sliced through me. It was the same tactic she had used my entire life, undermining my reality, framing me as overly sensitive, unreliable. Even here, in front of a board, she was stripping me of credibility with the elegance of a surgeon. The board members exchanged glances, scribbling notes, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a stern woman with silver hair, asked me directly, "Jocelyn, is it possible that you misinterpreted her actions in the panic of the moment?" My throat tightened. I wanted to scream that I knew the difference between love and malice, that I could feel intent in the weight of Margaret's hands pressing the mask away from my face. Instead, I drew a shaky breath and answered as calmly as I could. "I know what I felt. I know the look in her eyes. My mother didn't act in desperation. She acted with control, and she knew exactly what she was doing." My voice cracked on the last word, but I held their gaze, refusing to shrink into silence. Clara then spoke, presenting the testimonies she had gathered. Several nurses had admitted that Margaret hadn't looked panicked that night. She had looked composed, deliberate. One described how Margaret's hands held the mask down firmly, not trembling or frantic. Another admitted she heard Margaret whisper under her breath words she couldn't quite catch, but the tone had been chilling. The board leaned forward at that, some scribbling more intently, others whispering softly. Margaret's face didn't flinch, though. I knew her too well. Behind that still mask was calculation, adjusting her strategy, waiting for the precise moment to dismantle these truths. When it was her turn again, Margaret shifted the narrative with unnerving ease. She turned her tearful gaze toward me, her voice breaking in just the right places. "I know my daughter thinks I wanted to hurt her, but how could a mother wish harm on her own child?" She gestured lightly toward me, as if presenting me as fragile evidence of her devotion. "She's been through so much, and sometimes trauma can alter the way we see those who love us." Her words dripped with pity, painting me not as a survivor of her cruelty, but as a damaged girl twisting reality. The board members leaned back, absorbing her performance, and for a horrifying moment, I felt the ground beneath me crumble. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to break down. This wasn't just about one night. It was about years of silence, years of gaslighting that had left scars invisible to the naked eye. If I let her twist this moment, then everything I had endured would vanish under the weight of her lies. "She's right about one thing," I said suddenly, my voice stronger than I expected. The room went quiet, eyes snapping back to me. "Trauma does alter how you see people. It makes you see the truth more clearly. It makes you remember the nights you were silenced, the mornings you woke up afraid. It makes you recognize when the hands on your face aren't saving you, they're suffocating you, and I will not let anyone call that love." The silence that followed was thick, electric. One of the administrators leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his pen resting motionless on the page. The silver-haired woman who had questioned me earlier gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a flicker of hope through me. Margaret didn't move, but I saw the tightness in her jaw, the faintest twitch in her perfect composure. For the first time, the mask had cracked, not completely, but enough to reveal the fire beneath it. She knew her grip was slipping, and so did I. The board recessed for 15 minutes, and the tension in the room thickened to the point where even the air felt heavy to breathe. Clara pushed my wheelchair toward a corner of the hall, whispering words of reassurance that barely penetrated the storm inside my head. Margaret stayed seated at the table, speaking softly to one of the administrators as though they were longtime allies, her hand resting lightly on her chin in a gesture of calm authority. I couldn't look at her without feeling the ghost of her fingers pressing against my face, the memory of suffocation closing around me. My stomach churned as I wondered if the truth would matter, or if once again her performance would drown my voice in a sea of doubt. When we returned to the room, the administrators appeared more solemn, their notes stacked into tidy piles. I could feel that a verdict was near, and every second was a slow drumbeat pounding in my chest. The silver-haired woman cleared her throat and began speaking carefully, her voice carrying weight. She acknowledged the conflicting testimonies, my own words against Margaret's, but she also noted the patterns, nurses who described deliberate actions, an undercurrent of unease in their observations. For a brief moment, I believed they would see through Margaret's veil, but then the chairman spoke, saying they could not yet make a definitive conclusion without more evidence. The words felt like ice water poured over me, more waiting, more silence, more time for Margaret to twist reality. I glanced at my mother then, and the faintest smirk played at the corner of her lips, as though she had already won. It wasn't large, not even visible to most in the room, but to me it was deafening. That smirk was the language of my childhood. Small, sharp reminders that no matter what I said, she would always control the narrative. My breath hitched, and I fought the rising tide of rage that threatened to spill out of me. I wanted to scream, to rip the mask from her face, and force everyone to see the cruelty simmering beneath her polished exterior. But I knew screaming would only prove her point, that I was fragile, unstable, broken. Silence was her weapon, but I couldn't let it be mine. Then, in a moment that shattered the balance of the room, Clara stood up. She wasn't supposed to speak anymore, but her voice cut through the air like a blade. "With respect, this isn't just about one night," she said, her eyes blazing. "This is about years of intimidation. Jocelyn is not lying, and I will not let this board reduce her trauma to a question mark. If you want more evidence, then ask yourselves why multiple staff members felt fear in her mother's presence, why patients whispered about the way she lingered in rooms she had no business in." Her words were fierce, trembling with emotion, and for the first time since the hearing began, Margaret's composure faltered, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed into a thin line. The board members shifted uneasily, caught off guard by Clara's boldness. The chairman raised a hand to silence her, but Clara's words had already rippled across the room. I could see doubt flicker in their eyes, doubt not about me, but about Margaret. And then it happened. One of the junior nurses, who had been too afraid to speak earlier, suddenly rose from the back of the room. Her voice shook, as she admitted she'd heard Margaret mutter something chilling under her breath the night of the incident. "You're not that important." The very words that had cut into me, the words I thought no one else had caught, spoken aloud now like a dagger pulled from the dark. Gasps filled the room. My body went cold, a shiver racing through me. Someone else had heard. Margaret's eyes flashed with fury so quickly she couldn't hide it. Her mask slipped for one terrifying second. Her jaw clenched, her nostrils flared, and a low growl nearly escaped before she caught herself. But it was too late. The silver-haired woman's pen dropped onto the table. Her gaze locked on Margaret like she had just seen a predator reveal its teeth. Margaret quickly tried to recover, pressing a hand to her chest as if wounded by the accusation. But the room no longer seemed to believe her act. The walls of her control were crumbling, stone by stone, and she knew it. And the terrifying part was that so did I. Desperation makes dangerous people reckless, and I saw it ignite in her eyes. As the board began murmuring among themselves, Margaret suddenly stood, her voice sharp and rising above the rest. "You think you know my daughter," she snapped, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "She's always been like this, always accusing, always twisting things to make herself a victim. You don't know the years I spent cleaning up her messes, the shame she brought to our family." Her voice cracked, not with sadness, but with rage, and the room went deathly quiet, because in her fury she had said too much. The mask of the perfect, composed mother had shattered before their eyes. The silence was broken by the chairman's voice, firm and steady. "That will be enough, Mrs. Hale." His words carried a finality that made Margaret freeze, her outburst echoing like a gunshot still reverberating in the air. For the first time, she looked small, not the towering figure of power I had always known, but a woman cornered, exposed, vulnerable. My chest heaved with uneven breaths, tears prickling at my eyes. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first time I felt the scales tip in my favor. For once, they had seen what I had lived with all my life, and though terror still pulsed through me, so did a spark of something else, hope. The room felt impossibly still, the tension so thick it pressed against my chest like a vice. Margaret sat rigid, her once polished mask of calm cracked and brittle, eyes darting between me and the board members as if searching for a last-minute escape. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as Clara squeezed my hand, her silent support a tether to reality. Every moment of fear, every second of doubt, every year of silence had led to this. This was my chance, not just to survive, but to confront the woman who had terrorized my life, to make her answer for every cruel word, every act of control. The air was taut with expectation, and I could feel the collective gaze of everyone in the room drilling into my back as I prepared to speak. I stood, legs trembling slightly, but my voice did not falter. "I have lived under your control, your cruelty, your lies, for far too long," I said, the words sharp and precise, cutting through the residual tension. "Every accusation you made, every manipulation, every moment you tried to silence me, you have failed. And now everyone here sees the truth. You took what you thought you could get from me, but the mask you wear cannot hide the hatred beneath it anymore." I looked directly at Margaret, meeting her gaze with a mixture of defiance and calm I had never known I possessed. Her eyes widened briefly, shock, disbelief, rage, all coalescing in that instant. The silence that followed was electric, a heartbeat of anticipation hanging in the air. Margaret tried to interrupt, her lips moving, but her voice faltered as the board members raised hands to quiet her. "This is not a debate," one of them said firmly, their eyes piercing hers. "We will not allow intimidation or theatrics to influence this proceeding." Margaret's fingers trembled, curling into fists at her sides, and her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before the witnesses she had once manipulated so expertly. Clara leaned closer to me, whispering, "They see her for who she really is now." For the first time, I believed her. I felt a surge of strength, a sense of liberation I hadn't known since the first moment she had tried to suffocate me with the mask in the hospital room. One of the nurses, her voice still shaking from earlier courage, recounted Margaret's actions in meticulous detail. "I saw her hand pressing down on Jocelyn's mask," she said, her eyes flicking toward Margaret. "She whispered words that were threatening. I have never been so afraid in my career." Another nurse nodded, corroborating the statement, and the weight of evidence began to pile against my mother. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, a silent scream trapped behind her perfect veneer. Every claim, every carefully orchestrated lie she had rehearsed for this room was crumbling under the undeniable testimony of those who had witnessed the truth firsthand. The board leaned forward, reviewing notes and glancing between Margaret and me, a delicate tension vibrating in their deliberation. Time seemed to stretch, each tick of the clock a hammer driving home the enormity of what was at stake. Margaret's face paled as she realized her power had evaporated in real time, leaving her exposed. I could see the sharp edge of fear cut through the mask she had worn for decades. The realization that she would not escape consequences, that the world was finally seeing her cruelty for what it was, shifted something inside me, like a dam breaking, flooding my chest with triumph, relief, and an adrenaline-fueled certainty that I would no longer be her victim. Margaret's final attempt at manipulation was feeble and transparent. "They don't understand," she shouted, voice cracking, eyes wide with panic. "You can't do this. She's my daughter." But no one moved to defend her. No one flinched. The board members exchanged looks that needed no words. The verdict had already crystallized in their minds, and I finally felt the release of years of fear and oppression. I had survived the suffocation, the gaslighting, the isolation, and now, in front of witnesses, I had taken my voice back, my life back, and even in Margaret's desperate outburst, I stood taller, unbroken, triumphant. The chairman's final words carried a solemn finality that echoed in the room. "Mrs. Hale, your actions have been documented. We will be filing this incident with the appropriate authorities, and the hospital will ensure Jocelyn's safety moving forward." Margaret slumped slightly in her chair, the last of her theatrical defiance draining from her. I exhaled, a shuddering breath that released years of tension. Clara squeezed my hand one last time before guiding me out of the room, and I felt a strange lightness, as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis. I had survived the impossible, and justice, however slow, had found its way to me. As we left the room, I caught a final glimpse of Margaret's face, ashen, defeated, utterly exposed. She had tried to make me small my whole life, to convince me that my feelings, my fears, and my voice were meaningless. But that illusion had been shattered in front of everyone, leaving her powerless. I felt an overwhelming sense of closure mixed with the bitter knowledge that the scars would remain, that healing would be a journey, not an instant miracle. Yet for the first time, I could see the path clearly, a life reclaimed, a voice heard, a daughter no longer silenced. I would carry this moment, this victory, in my heart forever. Sitting in the hospital garden later that evening, I breathed deeply, the fresh air filling my lungs in a way that made every past moment of suffocation feel like a shadow I had finally stepped out of. Clara beside me, silent but present, smiled softly, her hand brushing my hair. "You did it, Jocelyn," she said. "You faced her and didn't let her steal your life." I nodded, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders, replaced with something new, strength, clarity, and the knowledge that I had survived not just physically, but emotionally. And as I looked up at the setting sun, I knew this was the moment I would remember forever, the moment I reclaimed myself. If you followed my story and felt the intensity of Jocelyn's struggle, her survival, and the shocking truths unveiled, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll join a community where real stories of resilience, courage, and the fight against manipulation are shared every day. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and stay tuned for more gripping narratives that remind us all how powerful truth and courage can be. Your subscription supports these stories and ensures you never miss a moment of drama, emotion, and triumph.